In 2022, the state of Illinois launched a bizarre, multi-thousand-dollar marketing campaign with a single desperate goal: to rename a fish. They wanted to take a creature that most Americans viewed with utter disgust and give it a clean, corporate-friendly new identity: copy. The reason? They were trying to trick the public into eating it. Today, the carp is considered such a toxic biological menace in the United States that the government spends millions of dollars constructing underwater electric fences and acoustic weapons just to keep it from spreading. Yet, if you rewind the clock 150 years, the story was completely reversed. This exact same fish was once treated like royalty. It was served in America's finest white-tablecloth restaurants, prized by US presidents, and shipped across the country in custom-built luxury train cars. It was supposed to be the savior of the American diet. How did one of the world's most celebrated delicacies become America's most hated ecological villain? The story of how Americans stopped eating carp is not just a tale of changing culinary preferences. It is a historical drama of environmental destruction, industrial pollution, and a series of well-intentioned government blunders that permanently altered the American landscape. To understand how the carp fell from grace, we first have to understand why it was brought to America in the first place. In the mid-19th century, the United States was facing a severe ecological crisis of its own making. The Industrial Revolution was sweeping across the nation, and with it came rapid urban growth and unregulated factory production. Rivers that had once run crystal clear were transformed into open sewers. Sawmills dumped tons of choking sawdust into the water, and textile mills poured toxic dyes and chemicals directly into the streams. To make matters worse, the construction of dams to power these new mills blocked the migratory pathways of native fish. Species like Atlantic salmon, American shad, and brook trout, which had supported indigenous populations and early European settlers for generations, suddenly found their spawning grounds cut off. Combined with relentless, unregulated commercial overfishing to feed the rapidly growing cities, America's freshwater fisheries were on the verge of total collapse. In response to this crisis, Congress created the United States Commission of Fish and Fisheries in 1871. To lead this new agency, President Ulysses S. Grant appointed Spencer Fullerton Baird, a world-renowned zoologist and the Assistant Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. Baird was a man of science tasked with a monumental challenge. He had to find a way to restock the country's depleted waterways and secure a cheap, reliable source of protein for a hungry population. Baird looked at the dying American rivers and realized that restoring native trout and salmon was a losing battle. These sensitive species required cold, clean, highly oxygenated water, habitats that were rapidly disappearing. He needed a fish that was tough, a fish that could survive in warm, murky, depleted waters, a fish that could feed itself, grow quickly, and reproduce in massive numbers. He found his answer in Europe, the common carp or Saprinus carpio. For centuries, carp had been the darling of European and Asian aquaculture. Originally native to Central Asia, the fish had been spread across Europe by the Romans and later cultivated in dedicated ponds by medieval monks. It was hardy, vegetarian, and incredibly efficient at converting simple organic matter into dense, protein-rich meat. In Germany, Austria, and Poland, carp was the traditional centerpiece of Christmas and New Year's Eve feasts. To Baird, the carp seemed like an absolute miracle. In the spring of 1877, the U.S. Fish Commission officially imported 345 German carp to Baltimore, Maryland. They were placed in specially prepared breeding ponds in Druid Hill Park. The Commission's plan was simple: breed the carp in captivity, and then distribute the offspring to farmers and landowners across the country to raise in private ponds. The announcement of the carp's arrival triggered what historians call a fever of enthusiasm. The public clamored for the new fish. Congressmen were flooded with thousands of letters from constituents begging for their share of the government's miracle fish. To meet this insatiable demand, the Fish Commission leased national ponds in Washington, D.C., right near the Washington Monument. To scale up production, to distribute the fish, the government designed highly specialized railroad cars known as fish cars. These cars were state-of-the-art mobile hatcheries, equipped with large, aerated tanks of water, ice compartments to regulate temperature, and living quarters for a crew of fish wardens. The fish cars traveled the length of the American railroad network, stopping at rural depots where farmers would wait with metal buckets to receive their free cargo of young carp. Between 1879 and 1897, the government distributed millions of carp to nearly every congressional district in the nation. It was hailed as one of the most successful public food initiatives in American history. But the triumph was short-lived. The very traits that made the carp a miracle fish in captivity turned it into an ecological nightmare in the wild. In Europe and Asia, carp aquaculture was a highly controlled art. The fish were kept in clean, managed ponds and harvested systematically. But in America, the landscape was vast and wild. Frequent seasonal floods washed over the poorly constructed farm ponds, allowing the carp to escape into the great river systems of the Midwest and the South. Once free in the open waters of the Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri rivers, the carp did what they do best. They adapted, survived, and multiplied, and they did so by changing the environment around them. Carp are benthic feeders, meaning they find their food by rooting around in the muddy bottom of waterways. A carp will dive its face into the silt, suck up a mouthful of mud, filter out insect larvae, worms, and seeds, and then spit the mud back out. Think of a common carp as a swimming vacuum cleaner that constantly reverses its exhaust. When thousands of carp forage in a lake or river, they stir up immense clouds of sediment. This process, known as bioturbation, destroys the ecosystem from the bottom up. The suspended mud blocks sunlight from reaching aquatic plants, preventing photosynthesis and causing the vegetation to die off. Without these plants, the mud becomes even looser, and the water becomes permanently turbid. Furthermore, the destruction of underwater vegetation eliminates the nursery habitats and spawning grounds for native sport fish, such as largemouth bass, bluegill, and northern pike. Carp also accidentally consume the eggs of these native species while vacuuming the bottom. Within a few decades of their introduction, the clear, gravel-bottomed streams of the American Midwest were transformed into murky, muddy channels dominated almost exclusively by carp. This environmental destruction quickly soured the public's perception of the fish, but the final break in the relationship came down to a matter of taste. Because carp feed by vacuuming the muddy floor of waterways, their flesh absorbs organic compounds present in the silt. Chief among these are geosmin and 2-methylisoborneol, chemical compounds produced by certain types of blue-green algae and soil bacteria. These are the exact same compounds that give soil its earthy smell after a rainstorm. While pleasant in the air and fish flesh, geosmin produces a powerful, muddy, and metallic taste. In European and Asian culinary traditions, cooks knew how to solve this. Before a carp was slaughtered, it was kept alive in a tank of clean, running fresh water for several days. This process, called purging, allowed the fish to flush the geosmin out of its system, resulting in clean, white, mild-tasting meat. But American consumers, accustomed to the immediate preparation of wild-caught fish, did not purge their carp. They caught them from muddy rivers, threw them straight onto the frying pan, and were horrified by the muddy flavor. Compounding the flavor issue was the physical structure of the fish. Unlike trout or cod, which have a simple, easily separated skeleton, carp possess an extra row of free-floating, branching bones called Y-bones embedded deep within their muscle tissue. Filleting a carp requires specialized, tedious knife cuts to remove these bones, and cooking the fish whole requires careful scoring to allow the heat to soften them. For a population that was increasingly looking for convenience, the carp was simply too much work. By the early 20th century, American food technology underwent a revolution. The widespread adoption of commercial refrigeration and the development of refrigerated rail cars meant that fresh, high-quality marine fish from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans could be shipped safely to inland cities. Suddenly, a consumer in Ohio did not have to choose between a muddy, bony river carp and no fish at all. They could buy clean, boneless, pre-packaged fillets of cod, haddock, or halibut. The carp, once a prized luxury, was quickly relegated to the margins. As the middle class abandoned the fish, it became associated with poverty and pollution. Because carp are incredibly hardy, they were often the only fish capable of surviving in the heavily polluted, oxygen-depleted waters near industrial cities. Working-class immigrants and impoverished communities who could not afford refrigerated ocean fish harvested carp from these degraded urban waters. The sight of carp thriving in industrial runoff and sewage outflows cemented its reputation as a dirty, contaminated scavenger. The miracle fish of 1877 had officially become the trash fish of the 20th century. The story of the carp is a cautionary tale about the dangers of ecological hubris. Spencer Baird and the U.S. Fish Commission acted out of a genuine desire to solve a national food crisis. They chose the carp because of its incredible resilience, failing to realize that this very resilience would allow it to outcompete the native species they were trying to protect. They introduced a wild animal into a new continent without understanding how it would interact with the local ecology or how its behavior would clash with the preferences of American consumers. Today, the common carp remains one of the most widely distributed fish in North America, a permanent fixture of the continent's freshwater ecosystems. While chefs and conservationists occasionally attempt to rebranding the fish to encourage Americans to put it back on their plates, the cultural stigma remains deeply entrenched. The carp stands as a living monument to a time when humanity tried to re-engineer nature to fix our own mistakes, only to discover that the solution was far more difficult to live with than the problem itself.